Again, in this particular video, we are going to study association between two quantitative variables. And to do that, we're going to talk about a statistic called the Pearson correlation coefficient. And we're also going to develop a model called the simple linear regression model, in which we use a principle called regression to the mean, returning to the center, in order to establish in particularly what we call linear forms of data, associations, quantify associations between two variables that happen to also be quantitative. So in effect, chapter 4 is about association. And association is a three-factor description of how we quantify the relation or lack thereof between two quantitative variables. And the three factors are form, direction, and strength. A form is said to be linear whenever you are able to place two variables at odds with each other, two quantitative variables at odds with each other. And one variable we're going to call by the letter x. And sometimes we refer to that variable as an explanatory factor or an independent factor, and y, often called the response variable or the predicted variable or the explained variable. And usually we're interested in using x to explain y. And this explanation has a form. And when the form is linear, what we mean by that is that a particular pattern is obtained when we look at individual observations of data, such that data values encompass this particular form. So what I've drawn here is an example of an imperfect linear form of data, where you see the x's. You are basically looking at pairs of values where one value of x is paired with another value of y. And the purple line is meant to represent the closest approximation to a mathematical format that actually connects y and x. So in a linear form, y can be identified through what we call an intercept plus a slope times values of x. And that's, of course, in an algebraic world, in a perfect world. In a statistical world, we also have to add the fact that the reality is not exact, that values of y and values of x are not 100% fully explained by this intercept and this slope. And so we need to have a third term. And that term is what we call a residual or error term. And so the linear model is one that is identifying what we can explain about the relationship between x and y. X explains y via the slope and intercept. But this explanation is imperfect or incomplete, and not all of y is explained. So the residual or error in modeling is usually denoted by the letter E. So we'll be focusing on models, on the linear regression models, on data forms that are linear. To the extent that the data is not linear, what gets explained is less, and what remains as a residual or error becomes greater or unexplained. And so after identifying if there is a relationship form, a linear form, we then look at whether this form has one of two possible directions. And the directions are positive. That's when you see a direct association between the two variables. Or negative. That's when you see an inverse relation between the two variables x and y. So when we talk about direction, we will be either describing a direction as being positive or negative. In non-linear situations, it is possible to see both a positive and a negative relationship for different domain values of the variable x. And then strength refers to the extent to which the model explains the relation between x and y. And it is the strength of the association that the statistical correlation and other statistics like the R-square and the standard error of the regression will be explaining. So all in all, the number of different statistics that we study in chapter 4 are the slope of the regression line, connecting linearly x and y, the y-intercept, which is what value the variable y assumes independent of x, that is when x is not a factor, when x equals 0. The predicted values of y, which is when we plug in a specific value for x and we observe what y is. The residuals, which is the difference between the actual values of y and the predicted values of y. The correlation, the R-square, and the standard error of the regression. So all in all, we have 7 different statistics that we study in chapter 7 to describe the association between 2 quantitative variables. What do we watch out for in this process? What we watch out for in this process is associations that are nonlinear or nonlinearities. Because if the dots of a scatter plot, if the values visually look nonlinear, then building a linear model is a bit useless in the sense that it's sort of like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. So be careful with nonlinearity in X and Y. The way we identify that nonlinearity is through a graph called a scatter plot. So we are able to visually check for nonlinearities. So be careful with that. The other thing to be careful with is with non-quantitative variables, of course. I'm not going to even write that as a possibility of being careful about, because it's clear that chapters 3 and 4 are only about quantitative and not categorical variables. The next thing to be careful about is outliers. And outliers come in two varieties. They could be extremely large or small values, both X and Y. And alternatively, they could be for one of the two variables. So you have to be careful with outliers. You have to be careful with nonlinearity. And you have to be careful with unequal spread. So sometimes we don't have outliers, but what we do have is very, very different variations in Y for different values of X. And that creates a situation of unequal spread in which we use graphs. We use the scatter plot as a graph to check for unequal spread. And we'll work through examples in other videos of how we graph and view scatter plots, how we compute correlations, and then how we compute the 7 statistics of simple linear regression. So we'll be doing a bit of all these in the coming videos. Thank you for watching this concept video. In the next video, I'm going to open a data set in StatCrunch from a lab and or quiz problem, and we will work on these 3 activities: scatter plot building, correlation, statistic calculation, and regression calculation. Anything yet? Thanks for watching.